Woodlands, Texas. Help me welcome Pablo.
Thank you. And I just want to make sure the mic, you're good. Awesome. Well, thank you for having me. I've never actually heard someone read that. So it makes me feel a little weird, like, who's that guy? Like, that's, I guess that has been my career journey. And I'm super excited to be here. You know, when Paul approached me about the group looking for folks to come and speak, and, you know, and then I heard the name InspiredLeaders, and I was like, well, I don't think I'm very inspirational, but hopefully I can share a little bit about my journey in leadership and help network with you guys, because I think regardless of what we do in our industries, we all share the same drama, the same joys, the same pain when it involves working with other people, whether it's clients or whether they're employees. We all kind of go through the same thing. So to kind of maybe de-elevate that background or what have you, I went to school here in Houston, and originally my plan was to be like a lab technician, or and work with vaccine development and things of that sort. And the summer of my sophomore year, I had an opportunity to work as a lab tech for Baylor College of Medicine, and immediately realized that the lab environment was not for me, because it's a bunch of introverts and they're just looking at the microscope, and you can't crack a joke, and it's just not, it wasn't really me. I'm a bit more of an extrovert, more of a people person. And so the lab that I was working for was doing research with prostate cancer, and so we had research nurses, and they were like, hey Pablo, have you thought about going to nursing school? And I was like, man, had my appendix removed when I was in 8th grade, and except for maybe feigning illness to go see the school nurse once in a while to get out of the quiz, like I didn't really have a lot of knowledge of nursing or what it did. But at HBU, we had a really good school of nursing, and so I just went and talked to the dean, and she said, well, you've got all your background in the last 2 years in doing biology stuff, so why don't you take the first class, and if you like it, we can get you in the program. And so I'll never forget, the first lecture I attended. Like, if you think of what a traditional old school nursing instructor might look like, so senior lady with a tight gray bun in her hair, and a starched white coat, and she gives this like amazing lecture on the art and science of nursing. And I knew immediately that it was for me, because it met my needs as a nerd with having all the science part of medicine, but it dealt with the art of caring and being that person of liking to be with people, etc. It just felt right. And so I did nursing school, and I really had no idea what I wanted to do afterwards in regards to what kind of nurse I wanted to do, etc. And in my senior year, I had the opportunity to start working at Houston Methodist in the ICU. We have a program at Methodist called Student Professional Nurse. It's kind of a pre-recruitment program, and so I had a chance to interview and got the job as a student nurse. In my first day in the job, in the CVICU, where patients recover out of heart surgery, our patient goes into what's called a cardiac tamponade, which is a rare complication after heart surgery, but can happen. And basically, there is bleeding that happens inside the sac of the heart, and it's crucial emergency that has to be relieved by basically opening the chest and relieving the blood. And so, this happened at the bedside, and so, the resident is literally opening the chest at the bedside, and I'm like helping, and I was like, man, I'm hooked, that was it for me. Seeing all that, I was like, I've seen this TV, I'm seeing it. Like most people hear them like, okay, I'm out, I don't want to do this. But it was really what hooked me into caring for these patients. And so I transitioned and started working as a staff nurse, night shift. Loved it. I did that for almost 8 years. The lifestyle that nursing provides was great. We work 12-hour shifts, 36 hours is full-time, so I'm working 3 days a week. I have 4 days off. I'm right out of college, so I have no other responsibilities but work and party. And it was really great, and just loved it. And kind of grew in the ranks, if you will, on the unit. We had like team leads, and then we had charge nurses, and you just kind of, as you learn more and get comfortable with the different procedures, they just give you more responsibility. And again, I thought I would just retire from that job because I loved it. And I was approached by a director of our hospital, because they were opening a brand new unit, about interviewing for a management job and being a nurse manager. She needed a nurse manager on the unit. And on night shift at the time, Methodist really didn't have a big fleet of nurse managers on nights, so I had never really worked with the nurse manager. I worked nights, my director worked on days. I occasionally saw my director, but really didn't have a lot of contact with management. Really didn't know what a nurse manager did. But I was ready to do something different, and a lot of my friends that had started with me on the unit had, gone back to school and gone to anesthesia school, or they were travel nurses going around the country, doing a number of things. And none of those things really caught my attention. I was like, well, I'll kind of do this I'll apply for the job and see what it's like. So go through the interview, get the job. 2 weeks into the job, I was like, biggest mistake of my life. Like, managing people is not like being a night shift ICU nurse where you're like taking care of your patients and you have complete control over what's going on. And so here I am like 1 week into the job and I was like, what do you mean the nurse didn't give the meds? Like, and you want me to go and tell them that they didn't do their job? Like, these are adults. Like, they should be doing their job, right? And not only that, we're professionals that have a license, and we give meds. And so why didn't you give the meds? So it was a kind of a big wake-up call for me as far as like, whoa, what's this leadership thing? And I was literally ready to just say, hey, I think I made a mistake and I need to go back to bedside. And down at Methodist, if you've been in the Med Center, it's like a city within the city. Methodist has like 5 or 6 different buildings that constitute the campus. And typically the leadership teams in each building kind of like, are kind of on their own little group. And I was kind of in the building that was furthest away. And so there was a nurse manager 2 floors below me that kind of came to my rescue. And he was like, Pablo, don't quit. Like, you've got what you need to do this job. Just think about, your nurse, you take care of people, there's a nursing process. Your patients are now your staff. And if you just think of taking care of your staff, then they'll start taking care of the patients you want. And if it hadn't been for Haji, I probably would have still be working right now, night shift in the ICU downtown, and not be here with you guys. But that really kind of taught me about shifting how I started taking care of people and taking care of staff. And then my career just kind of transitioned from there. Again, I tend to describe myself as a bit lazy, and I guess when you hear that, it's like, yeah, that doesn't sound like a lazy guy, but I'm not one of these like, wake up, or I was like, oh, one day I want to be like chief nurse someday, or like, that's just not me. I'm very laid back. I kind of let life happen. I kind of have some ideas of what I want to do, but I always like to have like 3 options, and then the day of, I like to choose which one is the best, so all my friends, hey, like, they never ask me to make plans, because I'm like, well, we could do this, or this, and they're like, no, just, I just transitioned from being a nurse manager, did that for a number of years, and then transitioned to be a director, which is a different scope of responsibility. And then I actually left Methodist once to pursue a work opportunity in Oklahoma. That was more personal life stuff that took me there. That got resolved, and so I came back to Houston and reached out to my old bosses at Methodist and came back and joined the organization. And then I had a great, at that time I was reporting to one of our VPs downtown, and I got a cold call from a recruiter that was looking for a chief nurse for a little rehab hospital up here in Shenandoah. It's now Encompass Health. And I had never done rehab nursing, and I really loved working for Methodist. But it was time to do something different. And I had this great relationship with my boss, who was also serving as my mentor. And so I was comfortable enough to say, hey, I got this call and I'm curious about exploring it, and usually, you don't tell your boss that you're thinking about exploring a different position. But I had that kind of relationship with her, and she was like, Pablo, like, you've been at Methodist your entire career. It's time to leave the nest. Like, go and explore something new. If it works out, great. If not, you're here. We'll continue to work. And so I got the opportunity to come in and work up here in this hospital. And it was very different than working at Methodist, so 900-bed hospital, acute care, all the fancy academic medicine stuff, to being in what we call post-acute care, which is after the hospital. It's a rehab, physical rehab, so people are recovering from strokes, accidents, et cetera. Very different kind of pace. It was also a change for me from a management perspective, because I had gone from working in a nonprofit organization, which is, not looking at profit or the bottom line, but obviously we have budgets and we have to meet certain standards to keep things rolling, to then working for a for-profit organization where decisions are made in a different way, and you have investors that want to get a return on investment. And so it was a big difference in how to manage that. And I just hadn't grown in that kind of climate, and so it didn't quite jive with me. And so I realized that about a year in. And I had moved up here to the Woodlands. I loved it. And St. Luke's was looking for a director of critical care. And I was like, well, my background is ICU, so let me just give it a shot. And at the time, I was not aware of how well connected this community is, as you guys can see here in this room. But all the docs that I worked with at the rehab hospital obviously saw patients at St. Luke's. And so they tell the chief nurse there, it's like, oh, yeah, you need to get this guy over here and work at St. Luke's. So transition there, was happy as a clam doing my thing in the ICU and the ED. And then CHI, which used to be, or St. Luke's, which used to be Episcopal Health Systems, got bought out by CHI. They went through that transition. And I had things kind of settled. That's what decided me to, or made me feel comfortable going back to school and start this PhD. And the transition with CHI came, and if anything I learned from that is how when you're managing any kind of change, communication is key. And there was a lot of opportunities that I learned there that I was like, man, this is hard to try to get information to give to my staff, and I'm not getting it, although we were doing what we needed to do. And then I started getting calls from my old bosses at Methodist saying, hey, we're opening the doors, would you like to come back? And that's how I ended up back at Methodist. And so through all that time, again, I never woke up saying, oh, I want to be like a senior leader in a hospital one day, but it's just happened. And a lot of lessons that I've learned through that, hopefully maybe we can talk a little bit about a few of them here, you can apply to yourself. And I'm curious also to hear from your end if you've ever experienced this. But one of the things is the balance of leading with heart and leading with brain. And I think, if you've ever listened to kind of Dave Ramsey and how he talks about if you're a couple and you're doing a budget, usually one's a free spirit and one's like a nerd, right? I think management tends to be a lot like that. You have people that are very brain-wise management. So here's the policies and procedures and here are the rules and this is what we need to do. And then you have also the heart part of it, which is we're dealing with people, right? So if we have a time and attendance policy that says, hey, if you're late X number of times, then I have to do a write-up. That's the policy. But if you're dealing with a person who just had a tragic loss of a spouse and babysitter relocated and now getting childcare is an issue and they're showing up late to work, you still have to balance that. You have to be fair because you have to follow the policy and treat all your employees the same way. But then how do you treat that person so that you make not exceptions, but you can help navigate those life changes on there? And so that's something that I've had to learn in balancing. I've made sometimes errors in managing too much with brain, right? And then people don't like that kind of boss. And then I've made times where, there's too much heart, and then I'm getting a call from my HR director saying hey, there's policy here, what are you doing? And so never anything significantly major, but trying to manage those two and being very transparent has been something that has helped me in trying to balance both of them. I think when you're working in teams, some of you guys are kind of solo, some of you guys are working in teams, but if you know that you're more of the brain person operator, then it's important to know that you need to have someone in your team that's like the heart person, because then the two of you guys are going to balance each other out. And currently at Methodist, Carrie Guerrero, she's our chief nursing officer, and I report to her. And between the two of us, we take care of our nurses. And I think we're perfect match because Carrie is sometimes very brain and kind of like this, and I'm kind of bring a little bit more of the heart things but boss, hey, we've got to think about this. And it works out great because we come up to a solution that's really important. And that's helped us then when we've been hiring managers and directors for our teams and looking at that hey, is this more of a brain person or a heart person, or is there a balance on there? And I'm sure our folks that work with HR could do a much better job of explaining that than I could, but that's something that I've learned. The second thing is communication, and all of you guys, I think, have just demonstrated your own personal ability in being able to do a quick pitch about what you do and what services you provide and whether that meets the needs of the other person or not. So you're already an expert communicator. There's a great book called Nonviolent Communication written by Marshall, I think it's Dr. Marshall is his last name. And got exposed to him a few years back because there's a lot of violent communication that we use that we're really not aware of. And that's something that I've personally tried to transition myself when I communicate and help then my team members communicate this. And so an example of violent communication is, let's say you have an employee that is the procrastinator or turns things in late consistently, et cetera. It's very easy for us to say, maybe I'm talking to another peer and it's appropriate to be maybe having this conversation behind closed doors, but it's yeah, man, John, he's such a procrastinator, right? And so that term in itself is considered violent communication or violent language because I'm not stabbing anyone with that word, right? And probably if I had John in front of me, it was man, John, you're a procrastinator. That it's the truth, right? But a better way to communicate that would be, the last 3 reports I've asked John to turn in, they've always been late. So now I'm not making this about John or his person, but I'm making it about the production or the outcome that he's doing it. And it's very easy if you just kind of pay attention to what you're saying throughout the day, you will catch yourself using violent terms, which, again, they're not really providing this obvious injury, but they can provide injury, they can shape the culture of your office or your team if you're doing it, but more importantly, if your team members are doing it with each other. And so shifting from describing people in ways that makes their faults or their failures or their gaps in whatever they're supposed to produce for them, making it about them, focusing it on the actual work itself really shifts the conversation. And that's something that's been very important, because it's really easy to say, like, man, they're terrible, or they're a procrastinator, or and just focusing on the work. That leads me then to another book that really helped me kind of also with these conversations. They're difficult conversations, and I'm sure our HR people here are aware of it, but Crucial Conversations. I don't know if you guys have heard of that book or not. They came out, that book has been out probably for about 10 or 15 years or so. And it's a group of researchers, and what they did was they went and looked and observed leaders throughout different organizations and saw how do people get things done or communicate things that are difficult in a way that is effective. And they kind of created a model around that where basically you create a level of safety around a difficult conversation for that person, but you still address it. And that's been something that's crucial in my own development. I kind of became aware of that book. The American Association of Critical Care Nurses partnered with them early on in their research, because hospitals are a perfect example of the need for crucial conversations, and they're also the perfect example of a lot of violent conversations. So you could have the surgeon that has very unprofessional or very violent communication with a nurse because of something that didn't happen or something that didn't get done. And when there's a culture that allows that kind of conversation, I'm using that example because that's what I use, physician, nurse, and even though we are a team and everyone provides, there's still a hierarchy on there, right? So if the doc is allowed to use a lot of violent communication, and the nurse is always receiving that, then the nurse is going to be less likely to want to reach out to that doc when they want to, right? Because they know, hey, every time I talk to this person, they're going to yell at me or what have you. And then you can actually have some safety issues where we're calling the doc too late. And Vital Smarts, which is the company that hosted these researchers to write this book, really observed the impact in quality when people don't have the skills to have a crucial conversation. So how do you teach a nurse 3 months out of school to go to the surgeon and say, sir, ma'am, X, Y, and Z, right? And do it in a way that is still respectful of the chain of command, but still allows that person to do it. So if you haven't read the book, if you go online, they have the models on there. It's really, really great. They use a lot of examples throughout different industries, and then I love their examples that they use also in personal life when you're talking to a significant other, a partner, spouse, whatever, because having those crucial conversations about maybe what's not being met in your relationship, because we're not very good at having those conversations, tend to devolve into a lot of things. But a big impact in work performance. The last thing I would say is adjusting to change, right? So I think we all work in environments that are constantly changing. So we've got our finance folks, the tax laws change every other year, every year or whatever, the government does. Real estate market, you have ups and downs that it reflects what's happening with the oil market. So change is happening constantly. And so, when we opened our hospital, and I guess it's summer of 2017, so a little over a year and a half now, the big bosses contracted with a company to do kind of a assessment of how many beds we would need and how much staff we would need, et cetera. And so they do kind of this public health survey, and they look at the growth of the community. They look at how many current beds are in Montgomery County. One thing that was clear, and this is why Methodist decided to put the hospital up here, is that we don't have enough acute care beds or critical care beds in Montgomery County, being that we're one of the fastest growing counties in the U.S. So it just made sense. A lot of people say, well, why are we building a hospital right next to another? The location sure might make a little bit more sense if we spread them out in the county, but that's where the property was. But there was a need for beds. The question was, how many beds should we open up with when we open the hospital? And so again, these fancy statisticians and folks put this plan together, and they gave it to us, and they said, well, we built out 64 or 68 medical surgical beds, which are kind of like your standard hospital beds, and we had 15 ICU beds. And so they said, you'll be lucky if you open in June, by December, we estimate that you might need staff to fill 30 beds of your hospital. And so we kind of projected our plans that way. We opened the doors, And within 3 weeks, we were occupying 40 beds of there. So, our plans, we had kind of lined up hiring waves, and we had offered folks start dates that happened throughout the fall so that we'd be ready for these 30 beds in December. We were here 3 weeks in, and we had more patients than staff. And this is where that whole managing with heart and brain, so you hire a person to work three 12-hour shifts, and sure, maybe they might want to work overtime, but they don't have to. We have a hospital full of patients that need that. And so engaging with the teams and picking up extra shifts to do that, having set that culture of people feeling that they were empowered, that we were communicating well with them, keeping our violent communication low. There was a level of trust with the staff that helped us keep those beds open. Partnering with our colleagues in the other Methodist hospitals and sending us staff helped us also keep those beds open. And then we had to just hire really quickly. And there's only so many nurses in Montgomery County to go around, and nurses have plenty of options to work around here. So that was another challenge in then capturing the right talent, because as you guys all know, the adage goes, hire slow, fire fast. And when it comes to healthcare, not that our industry is any more important than any other industry, but you don't want a bad nurse. I think everyone would agree with that. And how do you know if the nurse is going to be good or bad, when you're spending 15 minutes interviewing them? So kind of really defining, okay, these are the spots I need to fill in, and how to identify questions that are going to help expose the background of that person, getting real examples, are they BSing, are they not, clinically we can test, what knowledge they have also, and there's some very black and white things that we can ask nurses, but trying to do that in a very smart way, because we did see an uptick when we needed to open beds where managers got a little bit looser and they were just trying to hire more staff, and then our retention within first 30 or 60 days, we were having to do some involuntary terminations, which was really not a position we want to be in. It's a bad spot to be in from a management perspective, the staff member that's involved. And so tweaking that, okay, maybe let's redesign how we're hiring staff to get the right people on here. Finally, it's got it right sized. And so we, by December, the projections had been, well, if you're lucky, you'll have 30 beds full. We had all 3 of our med-surg units open, so that's the 94 beds. And our ICU was a little bit slow when we started, and now we're at full capacity, which is currently leading us to building out the last 32 beds that we have, an additional 9 ICU beds. And then our campus is actually master planned to host another 200 beds. So if you've driven by the Methodist hospital, kind of like the back end of it, which is all parking lot and water, that's all can be built out and do that. So, to finish up in dealing with people and the managing with brain and heart, I think that is the biggest lesson that I've learned. And I've also learned that the higher you go in the ranks, the lonelier it gets. When I was a staff nurse, I had 64 other nurses that I could complain about the boss or not complain about the boss or whatever. And I'm the only ACNO on my campus. I do, my office is in the admin suite. But it does get lonelier as you're kind of climbing up there on the ranks. And that's where I found the beauty of having a network of other peers and colleagues, whether they're in healthcare or in other industries, to kind of you need to maybe sometimes decompress, or hey, I need to have this conversation with my boss, and I need to have someone hear me out first, right? And you don't really necessarily want to do that with someone in your organization because, work travels and stuff like that. So having that person outside of work that can be your confidant and help you either mentor you or just be your peer and colleague and saying, hey, how does this sound? Or how would you pitch this is important. And then really balancing the heart and brain of the operations. So I think I'll finish with that and open with some questions. And I'm curious actually, especially since we have so many different industries here, if you've experienced that whole brain versus heart with your team and in managing people's, and if you guys want to share that with the group. Yeah.
First, I want to thank you for the help, things you provide for Methodist. Methodist is very good to my dad when he had both heart surgeries. So thank you very much.
Thank you.
Well, it really means a lot to me because it was the first place we went to with his first heart attack, and subsequently a second. So unfortunately, but fortunately he's still around. So thank you guys. These nurses were great. Yeah, we talk. I'm a big follower of extreme ownership. I don't know if anybody's read Jocko Willink's Extreme Ownership. And I practice a lot of CRM. If you're familiar with human factors.
Okay.
Familiar with that?
Yeah.
Maybe call it something different. So we talk about the dichotomy in leadership or the leadership continuum. How do you really? My experience is it takes both, and you have to have both. You have to exhibit both, or you're going to fail. You have to have breakout. You have to balance.
Yeah.
And sometimes it's going to take one, and it just shifts right to the other. How have you and your team have been able to manage that with the people below you? Because they also have to exhibit those traits too.
Yeah.
They can't just be totally left brain or right brain or left and right.
Yep.
So how have you been able to produce that down to the lowest common denominator, to like the lowest nurse, to actually lead themselves with heart or with the brain?
Yeah. I think this is where presence as a leader is important with your people, because you won't know what they need unless you're present on there. And so, in our organization now, we have managers and directors all throughout, and it's very easy with a calendar to fill up with meetings back to back and not be out on the departments or, out on the units checking out. So the first way to start is you have to be out there to know your people. You can't manage from a desk. That's like impossible. Whether you're dealing with a 2-person team or you're dealing with 300 employees, you have to be out there, and you have to be able to be at the very front line. So not then just hanging out with a manager or director, but I like to go and we have housekeepers in each of our units, and I like to know the name of each of them and know what's going on in their lives, and that's really important. In balancing the heart and mind, the heart and brain part of your managers is once you identify where they need to adjust, is addressing it early. I will tell you that's been one of my gaps, is probably not addressing things fast enough, and that's probably the heart in me where it tries to give people a little bit more chance, or like, hey, let's just give them a little bit more and do that. And now you've delayed too much, and maybe where it's been very evident where you're maybe coaching someone and they're just not responding to it. And so really the only solution is, a gracious exit is like what I like to call, and giving them an opportunity to maybe be in a different position that's not putting them in this spot where they're not performing. So acting early when you see that deficiency, where if they're only brain and people are starting to resign because they don't like to work for that kind of person, and coaching that person is like, hey, this is where you need to balance, doing it quick. I have another example where we have done that early on, intervened, and the manager had a lot of self-insight when we were coaching her. She really realized some of her behaviors that were being perceived by staff as like, oh, she's standoffish, or she doesn't smile, or she only talks to me when there's something wrong. When we just made her aware of that situation and what she needed to shift, and she's a veteran manager, she's been a nurse manager for many years. What worked well in her prior team, now she's working with a whole new team. So she adjusted, and she's great, actually. Now her unit has the highest retention rate. So, yeah.
So I heard that the Houston community is a little bit diverse. It's the most diverse city in the U.S. is what I heard. And I've been working with different cultures in different countries. And so you have a kind of melting pot here. So how is that similar to what you're seeing here in your different levels, having different cultures within ingrained in different areas? How do you manage that diversity?
Yeah, no, absolutely. So the workforce at Houston Methodist is pretty diverse. Typically, the hospitals tend to be, and I think probably our Med Center hospital might be an exception because we have people that commute from all over the city. The community hospitals tend to be slightly more representative of the communities where they're actually at demographically, but even Montgomery County is pretty diverse. So I think that goes back to the culture that we ingrain in folks as they're orienting as far as our values and how we expect staff to respond to patients and their families, but we make a big emphasis that culture that we're creating is almost more important in the way that we interact with each other. We have like behavior standards, like, if you're within certain number of feet, we expect to greet someone and say hello, or if you're it gets very granular as to some of our specific behaviors that we do. Right, and exactly, and so you have some communities or some cultures where engaging with someone, unless you've been asked, especially if you're like a lower ranking person, it would be seen disrespectful, like, oh, I'm not going to speak with a physician because I'm just doing the floors or whatever, right? And so teaching people that is what is expected, and then when we see the behavior, doing the positive reinforcement and coaching really helps. So that's big. The other thing that we've kind of shifted, and at least I do this, it's not part of our official handbook of what we teach, is the old adage, teach others how you want to be treated like yourself. I think based on where we're at today with our generations changing, et cetera, the better question is treat others the way they want to be treated. because that opens space then for me. If I want to treat you the way you want to be treated, I need to find out how you want to be treated, right? Because it would be very easy for me to treat you the way I want to be treated, because I know how I want to be treated, but that could be very different than the way that you want. And we see that with millennials and the other generations come into the workforce and engaging them in those conversations. So that's something else that I tell my team members directly as they're getting onboarding folks, is use that like, treat others the way they want to be treated. And so you have to engage them with them to find that out. So, yeah.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. Yeah.